What are the most important coverage / issues to include in hotel MSAs? So I guess this is phrased almost as, what are the new most important coverages and issues to include in hotel MSAs?
And let me jump in on that, because when you talk about MSAs, you're saying that you as an organization has a master agreement that you want hotels to sign. From the hotel perspective, they really hate that, to be honest. They hate it when you submit your contract. They hate it when you submit your addendum. They want you to negotiate off of their standard contract. That's how the salespeople are trained. That's the way the hotel operates. So the minute you're starting to go off the hotel's paper, if you will, you're creating issues. Hotels do agree to MSAs for large clients. So if you want to have an MSA, if you want to have a pre-agreed contract with a hotel that you can use across the chain, you're going to have to provide something to the hotel to make it worth their while to do that. You're going to have to commit to a certain volume of business per year, and you're going to have to maintain that, or they're no longer going to honor the MSA. The MSAs, when you do get them, often give the customer things that wouldn't ordinarily happen in a standard hotel contract. Because you are such a good customer, you may get more wiggle room on attrition. You may get more concessions or things like that. But that minimum is going to have to be met in order to justify the hotel doing that. In terms of new clauses or coverage things in MSAs, it's no different than any other contract. You always have to have your basics of your attrition, your cancellation, your insurance, your indemnification. I always compare hotel contracts to like weddings. It doesn't matter if it's big or small. You still have to have a photographer. You still have to have a cake. You still have to have all those basic things. And the same is true in any event contract. You know, you need to make sure that you have those basic clauses. And of course, the big thing now is the force majeure clause, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later. So, Barbara, what do you think?
Barbara, do you mind? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you actually mind, I think for the audience benefit, if, and Lisa kind of already defined it, I'm sure you were just about to do that before I rudely interrupted. Would you mind just defining for folks that might not be familiar with that acronym, what an MSA really is?
It usually means Master Services Agreement or some variation on that. And basically it's a contract that is pre-negotiated, where you say these are the legal terms are pre-negotiated. Sometimes even the terms like attrition and cancellation are pre-negotiated in terms of percentages. And so every time you go to a hotel in that chain, you say, here's our MSA. It's pre-approved. We're not going to negotiate any of these terms. All we're filling in is dates, space, and rate, basically. Barbara?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, agree with the definition. And those of you, whether you're corporate or association side on the planners, you know, understand the strategy with any vendor. You know, you negotiate up front all the legal terms so that you don't have to involve the lawyers anymore. Procurement loves them because all the terms are hanging out there. And then you're essentially adding in statements of work, scope of work orders, whatever you choose to call them, which really have the economic, you know, the particulars, the dates, the block rates, etc. So there's a real benefit to streamlining the process. Having said that, my experience in working with clients over the years, negotiating these across the chains, is that in a lot of instances, the groups can do better with the one-offs, if you will, that is negotiating with the properties. Lisa mentioned, you know, the heightened requirements on the hotel chain side to even get an MSA. All that said is, you know, in terms of language and new clauses, you know, it's really, I don't see anything that's new. I see things that might need to be enhanced or scaled down, as the case may be. So cancellation, attrition, you know, if you look across the portfolio of meetings that your organization does, how many are small? How many are these short-term bookings, long-term bookings? How many are day only, rooms only, et cetera? Mapping out your meeting portfolio is a good strategy because it does allow you from a business standpoint to go into the marketplace, to go with your RFP, your hotels, and really share the value of that meeting. And the terms that you have for that meeting, a short-term meeting, a small meeting, are going to be a lot different than a meeting that's very large, booked far out. And that's where I think templates can do a disservice to groups in general, just if they're not scaled properly. And I think it is important to scale a property. You know, often I'm posed the question, what clauses do I absolutely need in a contract that I'm booking 3 months out or less? What clauses do I need in a contract that I'm maybe booking 3 years or more in advance, that type of thing. So if you haven't gone through that assessment internally, I think it's a good strategy because, again, I think it has useful value internally and externally as you talk with hotels and chains about the portfolio in your business. Really kind of being mindful of that is a good strategy. I just don't think I agree with Lisa. It's worth expending resources and negotiating these MSAs, but groups like hotels get all the time. Well, you guys agreed to this last year, or you accept the last year. We get it. Like there's a whole new game in town. There's a whole new sheriff in town. All that set aside is, always both sides benefit from contracts being scaled properly, being appropriate references, and that really should be the end goal. John?
And Barbara makes an interesting point about that because the hotels and the association or whatever it is spend all this time and money negotiating the MSA, and then for a particular event, as Barbara mentioned, maybe it's short term or long term or whatever it is, then the customer says, oh well, we need to change it for this, and the hotels get very frustrated. It's like either we have a pre-negotiated form or we don't. We're not going to start changing it. And again, I think it's clear from my perspective, I'm not a fan of them. I think there's a lot of reasons, and I think Barbara would agree with me that sometimes it's not very helpful.
Perfect.
And I saw, Sean, one of the questions in the chat was about, in that RFP process, is it good to put your clauses out there? And my response is, I would only put out clauses that are absolute 100% deal breaker type things. And maybe it's not even the clause itself. Maybe it's the concept. So for example, we need attrition to be based on 80% of the room pickup nights. We need X, as opposed to saying we need this walk clause or we need this force majeure clause. I think that having the points covered is a better strategy than actually saying we have to have these clauses, because at the end of the day, you may churn out to want to negotiate on those clauses to close the deal, and potentially you're throwing off folks who might otherwise bid on your business if they see it as an absolute. Lisa, I'm sure you get that a lot from hotel customers as well, asking about these required clauses that groups have.
We do. I had one just this week where the hotel sent their contract out, and the customer came back and said, well, here's our master agreement that has to be appended to every contract that we do. And I said to the hotel, did they even look at your contract? Because their master agreement had every clause in the hotel contract with just variations on it. It's like, why are we doing this? So I think Barbara's right. If there's a key thing that you need, whatever it is in your contract, as part of your RFP, say, this is a clause that is critical to us. And you're going to get a much better reaction than if you send out these master agreements that are conflicting with the hotel agreement.
Totally agree. And I'm glad that that question was actually asked, because we agree as well on the HopSkip side. Part of the RFP process on the HopSkip platform is exactly that. Planners have the ability to be able to communicate their requested contract clauses. And we also see planners utilize that as more so communicating the concept behind the clause and the deal breakers associated with the event, not necessarily going into the full on detail during the RFP process, as that gets ironed out when we get closer to the execution of the contract. So great question, and great to see the engagement so far in the chat as well.
And Sean, let me respond to something in the chat that somebody says, oh, why do hoteliers hate contracts? These are addenda, and these are things that the customer needs. What the hotel doesn't like is that they have their contract and then the customer has their addendum, and usually they want to stick them together and they're just opposite. What we would rather have is the hotel sends out its contract and you say, I think that this attrition clause is too hotel-sided, too hotel-focused. Let's negotiate that contract. Let's change the numbers, rather than just sticking together two inconsistent documents. That's the reason that hotels don't like them. They would rather negotiate on their contracts and come up with something that both sides feel comfortable with than have two inconsistent documents put together. That was the point I was trying to make, and probably saying hate was not the best way I should have said it.
Well, I tell you, Lisa, I mean, the chat certainly, as it relates to the multiple documents, I absolutely agree too, as you do. One clean contract should be the goal. Whether you start with your paper, the hotel's paper, at the end of the day, one clean contract that integrates all the clauses. Otherwise, even if you have language saying, you know, if it's inconsistent in the contract, the addendum controls and vice versa, you and I have both been involved in kind of battles on that front. So integration of contracts is key. And, you know, I will say on the corporate side, you know, legal might come out with an addendum that you want to sort of slap on and fix everything in the contract. But as we've talked about over the years, that to me is not a best strategy. Integrating those clauses is what's key, because the reason we have these clauses in the contract, surprise here, we want them to be followed. And parking them in a 50-page addendum is not going to get it followed. So even just from a practical standpoint, I agree with all the discussion. Now, after the contract's signed, and you want to change the contract, that's the amendment document. And that does need to be a separate document. And you do want to go through that contract and make sure anything that could be impacted by the amendment is going to be addressed. So if you reduce your room block, making sure attrition shows on that front, that it translates or syncs with cancellation and the rest. That's a really important thing to do. Again, this is kind of blocking and tackling, but it is something that planners should focus on. Lisa, you and I kind of an agreement on some of these logistics over the years.
Absolutely, 100%.